everyone. Today we will be talking about Salesforce Developer Limits. So we'll be talking about multiple type of limits such as governor limits, push notification limits, or SOQL limits, SOSL limits. We will cover every kind of limits which are Salesforce having in this video. So this is related to whenever you are working on any code. So you might have hit on that you have hit the limit or too many SQL queries, like this kind of error you might have received. So we will cover about how you can fix those and how you can prevent these. So let's get started. So our first topic would be Apex governor limits. So what exactly is governor limits or Apex governor limits? So Apex code execution in Salesforce is subject to strict limits, which is known as Apex governor limits, which ensure that efficient use of shared resources are implied. So what exactly does it mean? That whenever we are executing our Apex code, it ensures that it is using its resources very efficiently, and limits are applied. So those limits which are being applied to the Apex code execution are known as Apex governor limits, and these limits differ based on whether the code is executed synchronously or asynchronously and applied per transaction to avoid monopolizing the system resources. So let's see what kind of transaction limits do we have in Apex governor limits. So first of all, we will talk about per transaction limits in SOQL queries. So if we will talk about synchronous limit, we can have 100 queries per transaction, and for asynchronous limit, we can have 200 queries per transaction. Similarly, for records retrieved by SOQL, we can retrieve 50,000 records per transaction, and SOQL queries allows us to retrieve records from Salesforce databases. Exceeding these limits causes a runtime exception and terminates the execution. So these limits, why it's important? First of all, for your code execution, you need to keep these in mind, and also for future reference in interview. Also, these type of question they may ask related to for a beginner friendly interview. So now we will talk about SOSL queries. So it has limits of 20 queries per transaction, very less than SOQL, because SOQL is mostly used for retrieving the records, but SOSL, if you remember, it is for searching the data. So SOSL queries are typically used to search across multiple objects using keywords. Let's move on. Now we'll talk about DML statements. So what is DML? DML is nothing but data manipulation language, which includes operations such as insert, update, delete, undelete, upsert. All these operations comes under DML, and it has limit of 150 DML statements per transaction, and a single DML statement can handle multiple number of records. So we can use the collection variables to store the number of IDs and then perform DML operation at once only. Now let's talk about records processed. So it has limits of 10,000 records via DML approval processes, or even by emptying the recycle bin. So DML operations are capped per transaction to ensure that a single process doesn't consume too much of Salesforce resources. So that's why we say we should have a single DML statement run for multiple records, so it doesn't exceed the limits. Now we'll talk about HTTP callouts. It HTTP callouts is nothing but which allows integration with external systems. These limit ensures that timely responses from external services will come to the Salesforce, and it has limit of 100 callouts per transaction and maximum cumulative timeout of 120 seconds. Now heap size. Heap size represents the amount of memory which is being used by Apex code for storing objects and variables during execution. So for synchronous we have limit of 6 MB, and for asynchronous we have limit of 12 MB. Let's move on. So for if we will use future methods for asynchronous Apex in Apex code execution, So this have synchronous limit of 50 future methods per transaction, but for asynchronous we don't have any future method calls. There is no limit basically. So for future methods are used to handle asynchronous operation in Apex, typically for process like web service calls that do not need an immediate response. So I guess you understand what is asynchronous operation, which runs in a single thread in a separate thread from synchronous operation, and does not indulge with synchronous operation and returns response in their own time period. So let's talk about CPU time. So this limit ensures the processing time which our code is taking. Complex logic, nested loops, inefficient queries can result in high CPU usage and hitting these limits. So what these limits are: for synchronous we have 10,000 millisecond, that is of 10 second, and for asynchronous we have 60,000 millisecond, that is 1 minute. So we need to make sure that we doesn't hit these limit when we are writing our Apex code and running it. So we need to keep in mind all these limits, or we will talk about what could be the best practices to ensure that these limits are in check in the end of this video. So please stay tuned. Now we will be talking about push notifications. So push notifications are used in mobile apps to alert users about relevant changes in Salesforce. It has limit of 10 push notification method calls per transaction, and maximum we can have 2000 notifications per method. So if we talk about certified managed package limits, so you might be aware of managed packages. They are nothing but the kind of metadata um, which is used in environment. So yeah, so it is apps which are built by Salesforce partners and pass a security review. So these packages get their own set of governor limits separate from our org's Apex code. So these certified managed package limit is completely separate from the Apex code limit. It has limit of DML statements, 150 statements per package, not per transaction. Please note it. And for SOQL queries, we have 100 queries per package. And these limits are subject to prevent resources overuse in multi-tenant environment. And if we talk about maximum execution time per transaction, so we have 10 minutes per transaction, and this limit ensures that long running transactions does not block system resources. So let's move on. Now we'll be talking about Lightning Platform Apex limits. So where does these limits apply? These limits apply specifically to asynchronous Apex method such as batch, Apex, queuable, schedulable, and future methods. So asynchronous processing allows for background tasks that doesn't block the user interface or synchronous transactions. We have first as our asynchronous Apex method execution limits. So this we have limit of 250,000 executions per 24-hour period. Why we are talking about per 24-hour period? Because it includes schedulable job as well, and sometimes we schedule jobs for running per 24 hour, that is it should run once a day. So it has limit that it can have executions of 250,000 or 200 times the number of user licenses. And this limit ensures that a high volume of asynchronous method does not overwhelm the system resources. So we need to, for each limit, if you are checking, that we need to make sure that system resources are being used efficiently. We are not overusing them, we are not overhoarding them. We just need to use whenever they are required. So these limits are making sure of that. Then we will talk about batch Apex job size. We are having a limit of 50 million records per batch job, but we divide these records in a chunk of data. So we run 200 records at a time, but we can run 50 million records per batch job. And batch Apex is designed to handle large scale data processing because it is having limit of 50 million records. and each batch job can process millions of records, making it suitable for tasks like data cleansing or mass updates. So let's move on. Now we have concurrent batch jobs. We can have five active or queued jobs at a time. Means we can have five jobs scheduled at a time, or they can be in queued. We are calling second batch job from first batch job, and similarly third batch job from second. So likewise we can have five active batch jobs. This helps us to balance system performance and preventing one process from monopolizing the system's batch processing capacity. If we talk about scheduled Apex jobs, there we can have 100 concurrently scheduled jobs, and scheduled jobs are typically used for periodic tasks like data exports or regular updates, which we want to achieve at a particular time interval, that is once a day, once a month, or every 6 hours. For such jobs, scheduled Apex jobs are used. If we talk about push notification, for Android, we have 10,000 notifications per hour limit, but for Apple or iOS, we do have limit of 20,000 notifications per hour. This help users to keep update on important events or changes even on their mobile apps. Now we'll talk about API request limits and allocation. So if you are building a project or working on a project, that is very important for you to keep in mind what is the limit of API request limits and its allocation. So API limits ensure that external systems which is interacting with Salesforce without overwhelming the platform, and these limits apply to both REST and SOAP API calls, including integration, data uploads, and third party apps. So for timeout limits for REST and SOAP API calls, we have 10-minute timeout. And for SOQL query timeouts, we do have 2 minutes for query execution. So timeout limits are critical for preventing poorly optimized queries or SOQL external system from consuming resources indefinitely. So that's why there is a timeout limit, so that they can achieve their functionality in within the time limit. If not, then this is out of the limit and needs to be stopped. Next, we have total API request per 24-hour period. So for developer edition, we can have 15,000 API requests per 24 hour. And for enterprise edition, we do have 1 lakh, and that is also depends on number of license. If we do have number of license, 1,000 API requests. For unlimited edition, we have 5,000 API requests per user license, and these limits are cumulative across all users and applications which make API calls within your Salesforce organization. Then we have concurrent API request limits. For developer and trial orgs, we have 5 concurrent log running API request lasting more than 5 seconds. And for production and sandbox orgs, we have 25 concurrent long running API requests. And then long running requests such as data imports, exports, uh, which can consume significant system resources. So these limits helps to prevent server overload. I know this information might be feel like very overwhelming, so you just take your time, understand everything bit by bit. You might not remember each and each and every limit, but you can understand that where all these limits are being applied, and yes, there is a limit. And later on you can refer this presentation. I'll put in the link in the description, so you can refer this and then go through it again. So just keep calm and try to understand everything. You don't need to remember everything for now. Okay, let's move on. Next, we have bulk API and bulk API 2.0 limits. So, if you know, we perform operation in bulk as well for bulk API using bulk API. Which is designed for processing large volumes of data asynchronously. Suppose if we want to import bulk data. So but we don't want it synchronously, we want it asynchronously. We can use bulk API, and this method is used for handling massive data loads without negatively impacting the performance of Salesforce platform. So maximum number of records which we can perform per 24-hour periods is 150 million records. If you remember, in batch job we can do 50 million of records, but in bulk API allows us to perform on 150 million records. And bulk API can even handle the massive data volumes, which makes it suitable for large scale integrations, data migrations, or mass operations. Next, if we talk about batch size, we have batch size in bulk API of 10,000 records per batch. And if you want to understand what batch is nothing but a logical group of records sent to Salesforce in a single API request. And in bulk API batches, which are optimized for larger data operations like mass record imports or updates. If we talk about batches per 24-hour period, we have limit of 15,000 batches. So suppose for 24-hour period we can run 15,000 batches, and each batch allows us to perform 10,000 records. So that many number of record it allows us to do, and it turns out to be 150 million records. So number of batches is limited to ensure that one org doesn't consume excessive resources with a large number of API requests. So we need to keep everything in check so that limit doesn't hit. Then we have maximum retrieved file size. We can retrieve 1 GB per retrieved file, and bulk API limits file sizes to prevent very larger files from consuming too much memory. Then we have maximum query jobs per 24-hour period. We can query 10,000 jobs, and it retrieve data from Salesforce in batches suitable for data exports and analysis. So this might be giving you an idea of bulk API, where we can use it, how we can use it. Like, it is mostly beneficial for mass imports, updates, larger data exports and analysis. So there we can use, and we can ensure that this governor limits doesn't hit for bulk API. Then we have job lifespan. We have 7 days per job. We can run a job for 7 days. Jobs older than 7 days are automatically deleted, preventing long standing jobs from affecting performance. And we have batch timeout as well, that is 5 minutes for retries. We can retry a batch for 5 minutes, and 2 minutes for execution, so that it ensures that it is efficient to timely data processing. Talk about SOQL and SOSL limits. So what is SOQL? SOQL is nothing but Salesforce Object Query Language, and SOSL is Salesforce Object Search Language. So in SOQL we retrieve the data, we search for any data. Basically we don't use search term there. In SOQL we use the retrieved term. So we retrieve the data using the select keyword, but in SOSL we search for data using search term, search keyword. So for SOQL and SOSL limits, these ensure that efficiently querying and prevent overly complex or resource heavy operations from degrading performance. Let's talk about SOQL query limits. So we can have query length of 1 lakh characters, up to 1 lakh characters. More than 1 lakh characters are not allowed in SOQL query, and this limit helps avoid excessively large queries which could overload the system. And maximum rows skipped by offset is 2000 rows. The offset clause is used for pagination in queries, but skipping more than 2000 rows would be requiring restructuring our query. We can have long running queries as well, which should be avoided to rescue the risk of timeouts. uh, if we talk about that how many rows it will return, it can return 2000 rows per query, and this limit applies to the number of records returned via SQL query. Exceeding this limit may require pagination or further optimization. So if you talk about like rows, what does it mean? So suppose if you are searching for select ID from account, so it would return 2000 records at a time, that is 2000 rows. And SOQL query timeout is 2 minutes for query executions and 30 minutes for query processing. Execution refers to the time it takes for a query to run, while processing includes the time to return and handle the results. So sometimes if you are having a large data, processing can take up to 30 minutes, but execution will take only 2 minutes. Let's move on to talk about SOSL query limits. So it is having maximum query length of 10,000 characters, but SOQL, if you remember, it is having 1 lakh character limit, and SOSL allows text based searches across multiple objects, but in SOQL we can either search in one object only or related objects, but not across multiple objects which are not having any relationship with each other. But it has a limit, that is SOSL has a limit on the complexity of such strings, and it can return maximum rows of 2000 records per query, and this limit applies to the number of records returned across all objects specified in the SOSL query. So let's move on. Now we will talk about metadata limits. So Salesforce Metadata API is used for retrieving, deploying, creating and managing metadata in Salesforce. So these limits ensure that operation involving metadata such as deployments or retrieving configuration settings which does not negatively affect system performance. So if we talk about limit of metadata retrieve, it can retrieve 10,000 files per API call, and this limit ensures that metadata operations does not overwhelming the system performance. And retrieve deploy file size, we can have the compressed limit of 39 MB, but uncompressed limit can be 600 MB, and this limit refers to the size of metadata retrieved or deployed using metadata API or even change sets. But if we talk about files in change set, if it is having limit of 10,000 files per change set, we can deploy 10,000 files per chain set, and it contains metadata components and configurations which can be deployed from one Salesforce org to another, such as from sandbox to production. Let's move on. Now we'll be talking about visual force limit. So you might be aware of visual force, right? Visual force pages, you might have worked on it. So we'll be talking about its limit. So Visual Force is nothing but a framework for building custom user interfaces similar to LWC, but LWC is more advanced than Visual Force, and limits are in place of related to Visual Force to ensure that Visual Force pages are running efficiently and does not consuming excessive system resources. So in and all, if you talk about limits, we are just referring all the limits should not consume excessive system resources, should not overwhelm the system performance, and should not monopolizing the usage of system resources. So we'll be talking about now view state size. So it is having limit of 170 KB per visual force page, and view state holds the state of the page including form field values and controller data. But we can keep it small, and keeping it small is critical for performance optimization, so it is required. And then we have maximum collection items, and again I repeat, as I have mentioned earlier as well, this information could be very overwhelming for you at a time, but currently you just have to understand and listen to it. Later on you can refer to this presentation, and then you can maybe remember, or you can go through it again, and you might not even remember everything at a time or later on even, but you can just refer the PPT anytime you want, and it is no big deal that you can't remember everything even in future. So now we'll be talking about maximum collection items. So for normal mode limit, we are having 1000 items. For read only, we have 10,000 items. And this limit, if we are referring to what is maximum collection items, it is applying to the number of items which can be stored in collections such as lists, sets or maps in Visual Force controllers. Then we have maximum PDF size for rendered pages. So we can render up to 60 MB PDF file in the pages. Now we'll talk about maximum file size for upload. We have limitation of 10 MB per file. We can upload 10 MB per file at a time. It controls the size of files that can be uploaded via visualforce page. And rows retrieved by queries, in normal mode we can retrieve 50,000 rows, but in read only mode we can retrieve 10 lakh rows. And these limits apply to the number of rows retrieved by SOQL queries in visualforce pages. And read only mode increases query limits for pages that does not modify data. So that's why read only mode is having more limit than the normal mode limit. Let's move on. Now we'll talk about platform event and change data capture limits. So platform events and change data capture are powerful tools for building event-driven application in Salesforce. These features ensure that users can subscribe to real-time events and capture changes to data without overwhelming the systems. So we talk about platform event limits. We are having high limit for it, that is volume platform events. We can have 10 lakh events per hour, and for standard we can have 50,000 events per hour. But high volume events are suitable for large scale data updates, but while standard volume events are used only for smaller or less frequent updates. And maximum platform event definitions, we have 100 event definitions. We can have 100 event definitions at a time, but that's the most we can have. And platform events are used to define and publish custom events for real-time integration and workflows. So I'm not spending much more time on the platform event. So if you might not be aware about platform event, in the video where I will be covering talking about platform event, what these are and what these does, so there I'll explain about the limits more. Then we'll talk about change data capture limits. So maximum custom channels can be 100, and selected entities can be per channel is 200. Sorry, CDC, that is change data capture, allows us to capture changes to records and publish them as events. Each channel groups related entitled for event driven updates. Now we will talk about push notification limits. So push notification enables Salesforce mobile apps to send updates to user. So push notification is nothing but notification coming up on your phone for everything. Even you might be getting receiving notifications from Zomato, Ola, Uber or anything. These are nothing but push notification. So for Apple or iOS, we have limit of 20,000 notifications per hour, but for Android we have 10,000 notifications per hour limit. And test notification, we can have one recipient per test notification, which can be used for development and debugging purposes only. And in app notifications, these are those notifications which displayed within the Salesforce mobile app itself and are not subject to the same limits as push notifications. So these are unaffected by the push notifications. So in app notifications are different from push notification. Push notifications come up on our screen even if we are on the different apps, but for in-app notifications, these comes up only on the app, not on the mobile. So let's move on. SOQL and SOSL relationship query limits. So these are again the powerful tools for retrieving related records in Salesforce. As I mentioned that in SOQL we can query related or objects which are having relationship with each other, but in SOSL we do not have that restriction. So these queries enable developers to fetch data from parent and child objects in a single query. However, there are limits in place to ensure that these queries do not consume excessive resources. So again, what are those limits? So for parent to child relationship, we are having limit of 20 relationships per query, and a parent to child relationship query retrieves related child records for a parent record. But For child to parent relationship, we are having limit of 55 relationships per query. And child to parent relationship queries allow access to parent data from a child object, just vice versa of parent to child. So these are often used in cross object queries. Recently viewed records, we can check 200 records per object. So even if you remember, in the list view you can see 200 records per object, and it retains a history of the 200 most recently viewed records for each object, and this data is available for 90 days. So relationship query depth limit. For parent to child query, we can basically dig deep down till 5 levels. That is, we can query till 5 childs from one parent, and but from child to parent we have limit of 2 levels deep only. And the depth limits prevent overly complex queries that can degrade performance by restricting the number of related objects which we can traverse in a single query. Now we will talk about recycle bin limits. So recycle bin is nothing but if we are deleting something from Salesforce, so it stores that data for some time before deleting permanently. So records in recycle bin, we can have 5,000 records per license. These are the number of records which can be retained from recycle bin until and unless we decide to delete it permanently. The oldest records, auto removal records, are automatically deleted after 2 hours if the recycle bin reaches its limit. Only if it reaches its limit, that's the point to be noted. But if it is not reaching its limit, we can delete it later as well. It will not get auto delete in 2 hours. And to avoid permanent loss of data, administrators should ensure that critical records are restored before this auto deletion occurs. Miscellaneous limits, certain limits, if they are not categorized under certain things or other topics, so we are covering those here, such as API usage, transaction processing, or file handling. So for file name, we are having limit of 512 bytes per file name, which limits this limit basically prevent issues with excessively long file paths during API operations. Then we have concurrent long running operations. If we are having multiple long running operations executed or having queued one after another. So in developer edition, we can have 5 concurrent long running operation. In production, we can have 25 concurrent long running operation. And these limit ensure that the platform remain responsive by controlling the number of these transactions. Maximum file size for API call is allowed. Compressed in case it is compressed then 10 MB, but if it is not compressed then 20 MB is allowed. And exceeding these sizes could result in deployment or even retrieval failures. For zip file, if we talk about in Salesforce, we have a limit of 1,000 files per zip archive. We can have 1,000 files in zip. And email attachment can hold 25 MB per attachment, and total email size should be maximum 35 MB. And this limit are came into place to ensure that the email messages sent through the platform don't become too large, which could impact deliverability. Now as I mentioned earlier, that we'll be talking about some best practices, that how these limits can be taken care of, how we can avoid these. So there are some practices, such as first is optimization technique. So this is mainly for Apex classes or things. So first is use bulk processing, that is make sure that in your code you are not having it for one record or two record, or there is a limit of records. Always operate DML operations on collection of records, that is have it in map or list and then have the DML operation. Then we have use SOQL for loops. So never have any query or SOQL in for loops. Always have the query outside of the for loop, and then you can run your operation in for loops. Avoid deep relationship queries. So deep relationship queries we talked about, that is parent to child or child to parent queries. So don't like these are having limit of 5 and 2 respective relationship queries. So do not just think that we should hit those limit or we can do this. Avoid having those going into those depth of relationship in those queries. Then we have monitor CPU time and heap size. So we need to regularly monitor our org's apex execution to ensure that we are staying within the heap size and CPU limits. Earlier we have covered the heap size limit and CPU limits as well. Then let's talk about governor limits and triggers. So if we are writing a apex trigger, so always need to bulkify our code. Again, bulkify is it should not return for that, it should be running for one or two records only. We need to perform all operation in such manner so that it will be running on number of records at a time. That is, DML operation should be running on collection of variables, not only on a single record. And also we should avoid DML operation inside loops. Use collection like list, set or maps to process records, as I said. Then we have future and asynchronous processing. So offload long running processes to asynchronous methods like batch apex or queuable apex. It will help us to avoid synchronous governor limits and improve performance. So that's all for this video. Thank you for listening to me till here. I hope you have learned something. And if you do, and please like it, like the video, subscribe the channel. And if you have any opinion or any question or even any suggestion, please let me know in the comment section. And thank you. Stay tuned.